Good evening, everyone. It's Nick Wilshire, and this is the ArchSoc talk for September. And yeah, I'm actually dialing in from East London this evening. So I've been out in the field, and yeah, it's been quite a lot of driving today. So I managed to get here on time, and we're all set. So we've got a great talk from Choppy or Antonieta Jerardino. She's from Chile. Many of you met her. She's no stranger to South Africa. She's worked in South Africa for many, many, many years. She really is a South African, and so she's hopefully going to come back to South Africa soon and do some more work here. And she's got ongoing research primarily up along the west coast of the Western and Northern Cape. She's got a great talk for us. We pre-recorded the actual slides and the content of the talk a couple of weeks ago so that we wouldn't have any internet issues this evening. But we're both online, and we're ready for the questions and answers section at the end of the talk as our usual format. I think last month we had Claire Browning's talk, which unfortunately we didn't have the Q&A section, but there were comments submitted after her talk. So you're welcome to submit comments again if you like to do that or prefer that format. But for those of you who are online this evening, please use the chat box on the right at any time during the talk and ask your questions, and I will field those to Choppy at the end of the talk. So this evening's title is Holocene Global Warming and How Past Foragers Coped with It on the West Coast of South Africa. This is very core to Choppy's research, and she's talking about climate change this evening or global warming around the globe. And while the effects may vary among regions over time, the best known are increasing levels of CO2, melting of glaciers, drying of land, often involving protracted droughts, extreme variability in tropical weather, and also coastal erosion and higher sea levels. But interestingly, palaeoenvironmental studies have shown that global warming has taken place twice before during the Holocene, namely during the so-called mid-Holocene Altithermal between 8,200 and 4,200 BP, and the Medieval Warm Anomaly around 1,300 to 650 BP. How were foragers affected by climate change, and how did they cope with the effects brought about by warmer atmospheric temperatures during both of these periods? She's going to go into this in detail in her talk and with specific sites, so I won't carry on with the rest of the abstract. For those of you who've never met Choppy, or this is the first time you've encountered Choppy, she's an archaeologist from Chile, and she came to the University of Cape Town in, I think, the late 1980s, 1986. Her doctoral project and later research centered around the late Holocene archaeology of the Central West Coast. And it involved sampling and radiocarbon dating of several open shell middens and several field seasons at Steenbokfontein Cave near Lammert's Bay. And that's an amazing site, north of Elands Bay, closer to Lammert's Bay. She also worked in heritage management for Heritage Western Cape. She drew up the nomination dossiers for Paternoster North Site A and Muscle Point Midden and Elands Bay Cave, and all of those were declared in 2009, I think, or 2008 to 2009. And so I interfaced with her as a heritage officer as well when I was working for Heritage Western Cape. She also worked for SARA from 2007 to 2009, and more recently at the Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies in Barcelona for the last 2010 to 2015 for 5 years. She's currently a freelance archaeologist and a research fellow in the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of South Africa. So without further ado, I'm going to move over to her talk. And once the talk is finished, I think it's about 35 minutes long or so, we will come online again for the questions. So please ask your questions during the talk at any point, and I will start making notes of those questions. Here we go.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation to give a talk to the South African Archaeological Society. I'm very pleased to do so. This talk is entitled Holocene Global Warming and How Past Foragers Cope with It on the West Coast of South Africa. The West Coast is this one, obviously, and I'm going to be talking about the center part or the central west coast during my talk, and particularly Lambert's Bay and the Elands Bay areas. Obviously, our planet, our world has warmed up many times throughout thousands of years, and this is a chart by the NASA, the NASA from the United States, showing what we've seen in the palaeoenvironmental record, how much our Earth has warmed up as a function of the quantity of carbon dioxide levels. And we are currently right there, but we know that warming has happened in the past. This is the last interglacial, and we're going to be talking about this little bit of warm-up and later. I mean, this is such a small blink that we can't really see very clearly, but the archaeological record gives us insight into that. The sites that we're going to be looking at are basically all these: Deurspring, Steenbokfontein, Deurspring 16, Steenbokfontein, Spring Cave, Hailstone, Midden, Duinville, Midden, and Tortoise Cave. It's mainly these three here with the support, sort of supporting information coming from these other three. This is a chart I have published before in different versions. Here, this is the most complete version up until now, reflecting the settlement patterns and chronology at the Elands Bay and Lambert's Bay areas. The vertical line here basically is the timeline, with more recent here, older down here. And along the horizontal axis, I've placed here the acronyms of the names of the sites that have been sampled and dated. There are many more sites that have been recorded and counted during surveys, but they have not yet been sampled nor dated. Basically, here the information is showing. We have, for instance, any site here down on the horizontal, and the little circles of different size basically reflect the amount of deposit associated with that particular day. So the circles of different sizes are dates, and the size of the circle is the associated amount of deposit, which ranges from 1 to 10 in the very small one, all the way to very big ones. Obviously, there are some very marked changes through times in terms of the amount of deposit, particularly around this period 3 to 2, but we're not going to talk about this period from 3 to 2,000 years ago. Rather, we're going to be talking about these periods here that I've highlighted in red pink. This is the mid-Holocene, one of the periods in which we had warming of the environment from 8,200 to 4,200, calibrated years before present, and the Medieval Warm Anomaly between 1,200 and 800 years ago calibrated. Thanks to palaeoenvironmental studies, we know for both of these periods, we have high atmospheric temperatures, lower precipitation, reduction in vegetation cover as a result, increased aridity, dune mobilization as a consequence, and particularly during the mid-Holocene, 2 to 3 meters higher sea levels. It's possible that also happened, or slightly less, for the Medieval Warm Anomaly, but that is still yet to be established. With regards to the mid-Holocene, it was suggested 30 or more years ago that hunter-gatherer groups avoided the coast and the interior altogether due to the local inhospitable conditions, something that Jeanette Deacon in 1974 and later by John Parkinson and collaborators pointed out. So we knew that the mid-Holocene was a period with very particular paleoenvironmental conditions. It was assumed that there was no occupation, but as we shall see later, or as we already can see in this chart, there are some sites already that showing new excavations and dating. Some sites show that visits were happening during the mid-Holocene. These are some of the sites, so the ones I had pointed out earlier in pink are the ones, the main sites we're going to be talking about, and the other ones are sort of supporting information. Starting in the mid-Holocene, where only hunter-gatherer groups visited the area, we have Steenbokfontein here with small amounts of material, but nonetheless quite significant, and also Deflation 16. A little bit of material, much smaller in Tortoiscave, dating to the very early part of the mid-Holocene. And here, we have Spring Cave with quite a bit of material during the Medieval Warm Anomaly. Here we've got some slides showing, some pictures showing, photos taken by the Empire. And and yeah, so this is how temporally or chronologically these sites are positioned in the local sequence. Just to make reference that what we describe in here on the west coast, we have very dramatic drop, very quick drop, along the west coast, increasing aridity here. So when we have very dry conditions here, it's not the same on the other side of Southern Africa. In fact, the opposite is the case. So what the palaeoenvironmental reconstruction I've just described applies for the West Coast particularly, but not in the rest of Southern Africa. This is certainly the case also for the Southern Cape, where actually a lot of sites, many assemblages date to the mid-Holocene. Some of them are very rich as well, many burials and so on. So the West Coast is showing very different patterning because it's more susceptible to aridity or to less quantities of rain. All right, so let's start with the mid-Holocene, also known as the Holocene climatic optimum in the early days. This is about 50 years ago. In Europe, it was called like that. This is a photograph of Elands Bay, the plateau, and a photograph of 2005 was a very, very dry year, and I used it as an analogy. Okay, we start with the settlement pattern at Spring 16. This is a very highly summarized depiction through showing the stratigraphic section of the site. This has already been published in the South African Archaeological Bulletin in 2016. Basically, the patterning here is that the density of all kinds of contents, except for pigments, increase in the younger levels, particularly around 3,260. So that basically the mid-Holocene is very sparse in terms of contents. There's quite a bit of material because lots of squares were excavated from the site, but the density of the material is very low. Also here we've got, well, very little also in terms of the actual beads and lots of them towards the top. And this basically shows, or how we interpret this is longer visits, during longer visits is when these items are produced, and it also takes a longer period or visit to lose one item of personal ornamentation, such as these. So basically, what we have here is that, in general, in terms of the mid-Holocene down here, we have brief visits. which we also interpret as low intensity of site occupation. In terms of Steenbokfontein, the mid-Holocene levels are down here, shown in red. And clearly, overall, the shallow depths of mid-Holocene deposits compared to the rest of them in the late Holocene suggest fewer visits during this time. Nevertheless, the production of feeds here was much higher, suggesting that the few mid-Holocene visits to Steenbokfontein involved relatively longer stays than later on. So suppose that this represents 3 visits, say, for example, as an example, 1, 2, 3, but fairly long compared to the 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., 20 visits. You know, just to give you an idea. Mobility in terms of sourcing of exotic lithic raw materials, particularly silkreed. Silkreed is available, this is the Central West Coast, our study area. It's available not right there, so but you have to travel or walk all the way to the Olifants River mouth or towards the Berg River mouth in the Vredenburg Peninsula. That's where you find it. Good quality silkreed. And basically the trend is that during the mid-Holocene, there are larger quantities of silkreed in stone artifact assemblages. Here is also the case. All right, layers 1 and 2 in Steenbokfontein is a bit out of this trend, but it's these layers, the sample size is actually quite small. So if we obviate this one, the trend also of higher quantities or higher frequencies of silkreed are present during the mid-Holocene. Tortoise cave shows a similar trend, although the very late part of the early Holocene or the very early part of the mid-Holocene behaves rather differently. But overall, what we can derive from this is that people were regions further away from where they stayed during the mid-Holocene. In terms of mobility and also networks, the case of specularite, which is a kind of glittering pigment in Steenbokfontein, is quite illuminating. It's quite interesting. This graph shows the percentage of specularite among all pigments in Steenbokfontein. We can see here that the percentage of specularite in mid-Holocene levels is much higher than during the late Holocene. It's 1 order of magnitude more. So this is very interesting because the source for specularite in southern Africa, the best known place, is in the Northwest Province, which is about 730 kilometers away. Obviously, this is probably via networks. I don't think people went directly and then came back with it. But most likely via networks in some sort of intricate way, not as straight as suggested by this line. Importantly then, this shows or it's an indication of likely of long distance networks, travel, possible gift exchange and or trade with other people, with other groups. And networks we know are important as a way to minimize risks due to, one, for instance, environmental deterioration and unpredictability of resource availability and then distribution of the landscape, which is precisely what we would predict and what palaeoenvironmental studies have shown for the mid-Holocene. Also, interestingly, among the Ham in the Northern Cape, specularite was very valued for its cosmetic qualities. Young men applied it to their heads with fat to look handsome. This is shown in my Granagan PhD thesis based on the Blake and Lloyd records. So one could ask oneself, was specularite used for more formal locations in Steenbokfontein? Because this is a very valuable material. It's not something that people would use every day all the time. It's quite precious, so it's possible that they would use it either as a cosmetic during formal location and or for possible exchange or gift exchange. Yeah. I'm now going to talk about deflation hollows. They are important with regards to the Holocene, I think. These sites are there to appear to offer further insights into this period and settlement pattern during this period. These sites are wind-eroded, shallow depressions in sandy plains of the sandfield, with evidence of repeated visits. I'm basing my observations on Tony Manhire's Masters, which was published as a VAR book in 1987. This is the geographic distribution of the sites of these deflation hollows, and here are the three main sites that, the three sites that I've mentioned earlier. Sorry. All right. This is a photo by Tony of one of the deflation hollows near Elands Bay, just north of the Lodding Plate. Unfortunately, deflation hollows can't be dated because or directly dated because of very little organic material present in them, and they're also palimpsests, so we don't know exactly which oxidation we are dating with the little organic there is. Nevertheless, stone artifact types and raw material profile in the majority of them suggest a mid-Holocene age. As Tony Manhire showed it, vast number of stone artifacts are dominated by scrapers and back pieces, and siltcrete abounds, very plentiful there. On the other hand, scrapers and back pieces are most common in dated mid-Holocene assemblages, such as Steenbokfontein, Spring 16, Porterscape, which I showed earlier. And the large majority of formal tools in these assemblages are made on siltcrete. So there's a, I think, compelling suggestion here that deflation hollows do date to the mid-Holocene sometime within that 4,000-year-long period. Turnit also pointed out the existence or the presence of large quartzite grindstones cached for repeated use, most probably because they're quite large. Unfortunately, that those items, those artifacts, don't appear quantified in the VAR in his publication. Also, he pointed out to varieties of ochre being very common, and with frequent traces of red ochre staining on grindstone. So that's also quite interesting, but unfortunately also no numbers associated with that. Okay, so obviously you probably already derived it from showing you this chart earlier on. But the geographic distribution, location of deflation hollows clearly clusters near rivers and other sources of water, a resource that would have been much needed in the context of hot and dry conditions during the mid-Holocene. So if we could place, hypothetically, without dating them, but using typological grounds to do so, deflation hollows would be somewhere here, dating placed in this chart would be located. In terms of subsistence during the mid-Holocene, I can show you the Steenbokfontein results, which are backed up by Durespring 16 results. The ratio of shells against terrestrial fauna, this graph shows you precisely that. And the higher the ratio, the more marine input or more mollusks in making a contribution to forager diet. And here, clearly, that is not the case during the mid-Holocene. So we have very much less shellfish making into forager diet. So it's a largely terrestrial diet. And most of the vertebrate species are local prey. In fact, almost all of them you can provide, they would have been able to provide locally. Heavily dominated by small bovids, including steenbok. Steenbok is a small bovid. Followed by Cape fur seal and rock hyraxes. But tortoises are there also present very much. This is to show you the consistency in the results in terms of settlement vis-a-vis the sizes of Chercina ungulata, which is tortoises, the most common tortoise. This is Richard Klein data. This graph reflects the sizes of tortoises in terms of lateral diameter of humeri, and basically showing that tortoises are fairly large during the mid-Holocene, much larger than later, which is consistent with the fact that people were visiting the study area less regularly, more infrequently, now and then, so to speak, when compared to later periods. Now we're moving into the medieval warm anomaly, also known as the medieval warm epoch. In terms of settlement, there's a total of 18 medieval warm anomaly dated strata, and half of them are locations above ground, at least 20 meters, and half of them, or 2/3 of them actually above, and half of them 40 meters above ground levels, and so largely, if not good views of the surroundings, it has people during this time chose to settle in places with commanding views of the landscape. These are some of the examples, like Soetpans Klipkeuvels, north of Lambert's Bay, Simonse Klip, where Steenbokfontein is located down there. Baboon Point, there's a little terrace there, and Spring Cave, which we will be talking about soon after. So during the medieval warm anomaly, there's an emphasis on high places, and these are mostly small or temporary camps, except for Spring Cave and Hailstone Midden. These afford good vantage points from where to monitor movement of people on the landscape. And as suggested before, this pattern possibly responds to a heightened sense of risk and or danger as a result of competition over key resources. And here I'm thinking of water and areas with fodder, which were most likely were limited during the medieval warm anomaly. One example then, which is very interesting about this period, one example is a Spring Cave. This is a site excavated in 1984 by Royden Yates, David Halkett, and Anthony Manhire. Royden Yates conceived this project and later analyzed did basic sorting and did a basic analysis of the contents, and we picked up from where he left. This site has a seepage right at the back, which is active even in summer. I've been there twice or 3 times, and even in summer, it's still trickling. Very important aspect of Spring Cave, and that's why the name, because it has a little spring at the back. These are views. This shows the views from Spring Cave. Spring Cave is situated 120 meters above sea level and faces basically north-northwest. So if we look more towards the west, there's Baboon Point, and Hailstone Midden is right there. And if we look towards the west and north, we see the dune field, and the site of dune field Midden is probably right there. And this is another view of Spring Cave from the west. This is just to show you how the stratigraphy looks like. It's fairly complex, actually, as you can see. A portion on each of the squares excavated. This is one of the squares excavated, and this is the other one. This is a plan view of the cave. I'm not going to go into details. This is forthcoming in the December issue of the South African Archaeological Bulletin. But just to make emphasis that there is quite a bit of material in both excavated squares dating to the Medieval Warm Anomaly. Okay, this is a table showing the densities of marine and terrestrial fauna plus ochre with layers 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Layer 1 is not included here because it's actually surface material, sort of the first centimeter or centimeter and a half with mixed material that includes even the very recent stuff. So basically, archaeologically, significant material is from layer 2 down. Basically, it's highlighted here in red. Densities of fauna, marine shells, and ochre are highest overall in levels dating to the Medieval Warm Anomaly, suggesting a relatively more intense occupation of Spring Cave at that time. So even though you could see earlier that, it's a portion, it's not most of what the sequence shows, but I must say that this is very sandy down here, all the way down. It's much more concentrated around these levels. I've put here some preliminary observations in terms of subsistence based on also another ratio, kilograms of shell per number of identified specimens, fragments of mammals, that is excluding carnivores. And we have here, in contrast to the mid-Holocene situation in Spring Cave and Spring, the dietary ratio is not as low compared to the other layers. Anything from 5 and down is older than 3,000 years before present. This is the Medieval Warm Anomaly, and we actually have more of a mixed situation here with some input of a marine component and terrestrial as well. We're not going to go into detail. It's actually quite a busy table, but it's just to show you that a full species identification has been done by Richard Klein and Kathy Gerton. Used to be Chris Reader before. But just to highlight the presence of all these carnivores here, which are summarized, the table has been summarized in this figure into different categories of taxa. And here carnivores, very interesting to see that they are particularly abundant, particularly frequent in layers 3 and 4, which date to the medieval warm anomaly. So that is quite significant. 21% of the mammal nests belong to carnivore species. That is very significant. All right, one says also these two species are the largest one, and they may have been used, their pelts may have been used for making carrosses or bags or something like that. So excluding jackal and caracal, 11.4, still 11.4 of mammal nests in Spring Cave are small carnivores, which is one order of magnitude higher than in any other nearby site, such as Elandfay Cave, Tortoise Cave, etc., dating to the last 1200 years. And hailstone midden, which I showed in that picture from that photograph taken from Spring Cave, hailstone midden is an entirely medieval warm anomaly site. 11% of the nests constitute small carnivore, are made by small carnivore. So it's quite significant, the presence of these small species, which normally we know they're not accessed, they are not procured as food. Let's see, before we get into the interpretation of that record, let's see where small carnivores occur elsewhere in the West Coast. One is Castile-Bergby, where unusually large numbers of small carnivore bones are present in this herder site. In fact, largest frequencies and diversity of them are present in medieval warm anomaly levels, and this has been already published or reported actually in terms of a table. Another site relevant here to mention is Dunefield Midden, where small carnivore burials were found and reported in 2008. And much of this site also dates to the closing century of the medieval warm anomaly. So that is also very interesting. It seems that small carnivore were important during this period. Sorry. Now relevant here is this booklet, this publication by Andrew Smith and Roy Piper in the Annals of the South African Cultural History Museum, and these were the translation, or the reproduction first, or the documentation in Dutch and its translation into English of the recordings taken by Colonel Robert Jacob Gordon during a trip up the west coast all the way to the Orange River, and notes on the Khoikhoi. Particular recordings taken in 1779. Robert Gordon described that mangoes were caught by dogs and slaughtered by the oldest woman in a group. He says that flesh was thrown away, but the skin was worn on their head like a cap until it became tattered. This type of ritual slaughter was done in order to bring good luck and for averting illness. So these descriptions, then based on these descriptions, ritual slaughter and related behavior has been argued to explain the unusually large numbers of carnivores in KBB and the presence of carnivore burials in Dunefield Midden. So back now to Spring Cave. You can see here, so green here because of the constant trickling of the seepage of water from the seepage. So they say, okay, very well, very well. Some could argue that carnivores could have been attracted to food-grade debris left after each of the many visits to Spring Cave. Maybe people were not really accessing them specifically. This hypothesis would need to be followed up with taphonomic studies, obviously, such as assessing the presence of possible cut marks and other bone surface modification on carnivore bones. You know, we need to know whether these carcasses, the animals, were actually accessed and then skinned and leaving particular cut marks on bones. In order to infer their procurement by people. But it's also likely, on the other hand, if we find these cut marks, that slaughter of small carnivores and its positive symbolic meaning would have been used to mediate higher levels of stress brought about by shortages of water and infrequent droughts during the medieval warm anomaly, or perhaps not only because of those frequent droughts or shortages, but also a perceived uncertainty, you know, given the situation, the paleoenvironmental context at that time. So if these rituals, these slaughters of small carnivores were repeated, were done repeatedly in Spring Cave, undertaking such rituals near a source of water, such as the seepage point, may have been particularly powerful for people. And I know this is speculative, but it's something to take into account when trying to understand why people would have targeted Spring Cave for occupation, because this site has, among all sites, and with hailstone Bedden, has got lots of deposit compared to the little bits elsewhere during this period. So if we're now we're coming more or less to summarizing everything, let's compare more or less the mid-Holocene and the medieval warm anomaly in terms of our table. Responses to climate change, we've got to take into account though that this mid-Holocene has got only hunter-gatherer and a low population, and here we've got hunter-gatherers and herder, and somewhat higher population numbers. You know. So in terms of settlement, are fairly similar, infrequent but sustained visits to the area, but mostly near rivers and plains. This is also infrequent, but with a preference for high place locations. In terms of mobility here, we have relatively far and wide movements from where lithic raw materials were sourced, and long-distance networks. The workings of these networks to travel and exchange were very important, most likely in order to minimize risk. Here, mobility seems to have been within the sandfield. There's no evidence for the existence of long-distance networks as of yet, and rather possible intergroup competition or avoidance, at least. And in terms of subsistence, in both cases, they were largely relying on, They were largely relying on local terrestrial resources, perhaps more of a mix during the medieval warm anomaly, and probably also a little bit of occasionally also slaughtering small stock. There is evidence for sheep in Spring Cave as well. Ritual was also important. Formal location, I wouldn't say it's ritual, but anything close to it is formal locations, as the Boekfontein as evidence or suggested by the quantities of like glittering pigment and micaceous material, and also possibly obdurring and deflation hollows because of the quantities of ochre. And during the medieval warm anomaly, obviously, as we've just said, we're seeing here more frequent performance of ritual slaughter of small carnivores, and for bringing a sense of protection and well-being. And as I say, also perhaps to have less of a sense of danger. Yeah? And yeah, so many thanks to UNISA for the support received in the last 8 years, and thank you to various funding agencies over the years, including in the 1990s. And I'll be very happy to answer any questions if you have any. Happy to address anything, any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we're back, Choppy.
Yes.
Great. Yeah, there'll be a little bit of a lag between the video and yeah, the software streaming is quite odd in some respects. So it starts looping immediately and so on. So, but I think we're on, and hopefully everyone can hear us. So if you guys could pop your questions on the chat box. I haven't seen any questions come in yet. Let's see if anyone has something. I'm going to start off with one. Just in the field work I've been carrying out over the last couple of weeks, we're working in the Beaufort West area in Richmond, in the Western and Northern Cape. And the farmers have been talking about this long drought that they've been having there. I think it's in the 5th or 6th year now. Beaufort West is pretty much run dry, and they're relying on borehole water for the town. So how does your archaeological research look at that kind of level of, so these micro droughts? Is there any way that this sort of these very drastic events would come up in the archaeological record?
Yes, thanks for the question. Well, it's so short, I guess it would be difficult to resolve short episodes of drought. Nothing. It has to be something that radiocarbon dates can pick up. Usually, I don't know, probably something more than 50-year long drought one would be able to see it. Obviously, palaeoenvironmental records such as dust seed middens and others, which are usually frequently associated with archaeological sites, would be able to pick up that more easily. But archaeologically, I'd say we might be able to pick it up, but very rarely, or maybe in future when dating is improved substantially in terms of gaining resolution, chronological resolution. I could, yes.
No, I suppose from a hunter-gatherer record or a herder record, it would be. I think the assumption would be they would be more adaptable. They have less reliance on crops, for instance. So I suppose if you're looking at an Iron Age site, a 5 or 10-year drought might come up more easily. Also, the effects of an abandonment of the whole settlement.
Yes. Yes, I guess, yeah, I guess I was thinking sort of hunter-gatherer and simple herder mode. I wasn't really thinking of more complex societies, but certainly, yes, of course, of course. Places where towns were built and so on, that's probably definitely a very different story, and that it would be easier to detect such shorter events. I mean, here in Chile, we're having a 12-year-long drought
Wow.
in central Chile. But fortunately, well, there are the Andes, so there's plenty of water. But to get back to that, what I would like to comment as well is the contrast between the purely hunter-gatherers and then the mix of people. Obviously, it's a different. Uh, we have different densities of people on the landscape, certainly much less during the mid-Holocene and a little bit more, but not a hell of a lot during the medieval warm anomaly. The one thing I can say, and thinking in the present, is that those two coping mechanisms, there are two of the various possibilities we can go about with the current global warming situation on the planet. And the one chose to be in contact with other people and resolve issues, problems, survival, and so on by contacting other people, by working together, so to speak. We can stretch it a little bit further. On the other hand, one can retreat into oneself, either as an individual but also as groups, and try to work it oneself, and watching closely what other people are doing, from the distance.
Mm, mm,
I
mm.
think, in a way, archaeology is showing us that humankind tend to repeat history in a way. But we can reflect on that and perhaps come about with more creative solutions.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, we've got a question from David Murray. He's also one of our eCrag members, and he asks, um, well, thanks for an interesting talk. And what is likely to have happened to population size during these periods? Was survival inland that much easier? So he's wondering about that comparison between inland and coastal populations.
Yes, thanks a lot. Um, there is evidence for mid-Holocene occupation around the Olifants River Valley. There are some sites there, Renban and other, I think, Andriesgrond, I can't remember. But there are some sites, there are few, but there is presence. And probably people were concentrating closer to river valleys, anywhere where water was available. So probably people were quite focused in different places. I mean, there are models, there have been models used throughout decades in archaeology, talking about refuge areas and so on, where people would flock and concentrate because it's easier to live there. Certainly, the south coast, there was no problem. In fact, it was a flourishing town. The mid-Holocene was almost like a renaissance in terms of Holocene archaeology in southern Africa. So, yeah, in terms of the West Coast, people probably went fast through the harshest areas and then spent more time where life was easier. Uh, and maybe some moved eventually over some decades towards the south and, well, had to interact with people there and see how they could make their living and have some space where territories or areas were already occupied.
Mm, mm. Thanks, Joppy. I don't see any more questions. I think we have a very quiet audience this evening. But I was just also thinking about those carnivores at Spring
Yes.
Cave, and it's really interesting. It seems, I mean, obviously you mentioned you have to do more research in the taphonomy, but it seems to be quite odd, and it does stand out in what you've analyzed so far. And I mean, do you want to do further research in the rock painting record? I mean, I think you touched on that as well. I think it'd be quite interesting to go back through all the images and see, if there are more examples of this ritual headdress or ritual use of skins and so on. So I think that sort of on the top of my head, there are quite a few sites where there seems to be something people are wearing on their head.
Right, right. No, it would be fantastic if that sort of studies could be continued. I think it would be fantastic. But yeah, Springate itself, unfortunately, the preservation of rock art is not good. There's some smudges there that indicate that probably rock art was present there. But the surface, the rock surface, is not good. It's one of those I can't quite particularly describe it, but it's one of those where paintings wouldn't have survived for very long. There is another high up cave a little bit towards the west, which is Handprint Cave, which is full of handprints.
Mm.
So maybe there are some other images that could be looked at in more detail. And yes, the study of the carnivore assemblages, I think it's quite would be quite nice. I have liaised with people from UNISA, from my department, so that with Natalie Swanepoel for some students to take it up. There's quite a
Mm.
bit of work to be done and compare whatever is found in Spring Cave to sites that have known medieval warm anomaly material in them and so on.
Mm. And where to from here? Are you going to carry on working on these specific sites, or have you got some other sites in mind that you're looking for correlations with these findings?
Um, I think one would need to look at hailstone midden again. It would be good to sample. I mean, it's a site that is what has been sampled as only 2 square meters, and already quite a bit of material has been found there. That was published in 1988 by Dieter Nolli. I failed to include that detail when I mentioned hailstone midden. Um, so that would be also another important thing to do to sample there. Myself, I'm busy following up on other things as well, in collaboration with Richard Klein, but more involving the Vredenburg Peninsula. And some middens there. But yeah, no, I think in terms of what I presented here, the next thing would be to open up at least 2 more squares in Helston Midden. Yeah.
Brilliant. We'll look forward to that. Yeah, this has been a great talk. You had a wonderful array of examples and charts, and you've covered a lot of ground, and I think it was a very, very interesting talk, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. I think I've got a better audio quality of your talk. There's some background noise that was picking up in the stream, so I'm going to see if I can upload a cleaner quality version of your talk to our YouTube channel. Hopefully, the one that I've got doesn't have the background noise. I'll check that first. And sorry to everyone for all the repeats. It's just part of the streaming software and the way it clicks in, and you don't get the chance to undo it. And unfortunately, when I started the first one, it appeared to have been jumped way ahead and I don't think it was. So sorry for that. And but yeah, so the third time lucky we got it through from beginning to end correctly. And I just wanted to say thank you very much to Choppy for giving the talk this evening and for being here on the call live for your questions. And yeah, we just wanted to wish you the best of luck for all your research and on your ongoing research. And you will be a very welcome visitor when you come back to Cape Town, COVID willing, and we will definitely have a few cups of tea and catch up when you get to Cape Town. Yes, and so hopefully everyone has a great evening, and thanks for staying on the stream. And as usual, the talk will be available on the same link, and I'll add notes to the talk for the uploaded one, which has a better quality version as well. So thank you to everyone, and catch you all in a month's time. Good night.